The warning didn't arrive with explosions or headlines. It arrived quietly, in intelligence briefings, satellite reports, and late-night calls between diplomats. In Washington, analysts stared at maps of Nigeria, tracing fault lines that had nothing to do with borders and everything to do with belief. To most of the world, the violence looked distant, tragic, and local. To the White House, it looked like the early stage of something far more dangerous. Then came an unexpected move. Donald Trump, a president known for trade wars and blunt deals, began pressing Nigeria over religious violence. Not softly, not symbolically, but with the kind of urgency usually reserved for failing states and strategic allies on the brink. Behind closed doors, officials weren't asking if instability would spread, they were asking how fast. Investors across Europe watched nervously. African leaders quietly compared notes. And Nigeria found itself at the center of a global concern it never publicly asked for. This story isn't just about faith or politics. It's about demographics colliding with power, about a country too important to fail and too fragile to ignore. It's about what Washington believed it saw coming, long before the rest of the world paid attention. Could this kind of pressure happen to any nation walking a similar path? And what happens when global warnings are seen, but not truly heard? If stories like this pull you in, subscribe as we uncover the hidden forces shaping our world. And tell us, where are you watching from? Nigeria did not wake up one morning in crisis. The tension had been building quietly for decades, layered beneath rapid population growth, uneven development, and a fragile balance between faiths. In the country's vast middle belt, where Muslim-majority north meets Christian-majority south, communities that once traded and farmed side by side began to drift apart. Land disputes turned personal. Political promises sharpened old identities. And violence that once flared briefly now lingered, returning with unsettling regularity. To many Nigerians, it felt like history repeating itself. To foreign observers, it looked like something evolving into a new phase. What changed was scale and pattern. Attacks were no longer isolated or easily explained away as local clashes. Analysts tracking the violence noticed rhythms. Retaliations following elections, spikes during economic downturns, silence before sudden escalation. In Washington, these details mattered. The concern wasn't just humanitarian. Nigeria sits at the heart of West Africa's economy, anchors regional security operations, and supplies energy to global markets. Instability here would not stay contained. European diplomats began flagging migration risks. Intelligence agencies compared Nigeria's trajectory to other regions where religious tension had metastasized into prolonged conflict. By the time briefings reached the Oval Office, the question had shifted. This was no longer about whether Nigeria could manage its internal divisions. It was about what would happen if it couldn't, and how quickly consequences would ripple outward. Faith, once treated as a cultural detail in foreign policy, was suddenly central to strategic forecasting. And for a White House obsessed with leverage and outcomes, the warning signs were becoming impossible to ignore. The numbers quietly intensified the fear. Nigeria was on track to become the third most populous country on earth, with millions of young people entering adulthood in regions already strained by unemployment and weak governance. In Washington, demographic charts were studied like warning sirens. History had shown that when youthful populations collide with identity-based politics, the result is rarely contained. Faith, in this context, was no longer just belief. It was becoming a mobilizing force, capable of shaping loyalty faster than institutions could respond. Foreign correspondents on the ground noticed subtle changes. Places of worship doubled as centers of influence. Sermons carried political undertones. Social media amplified fear faster than facts. For citizens in affected regions, daily life narrowed, routes avoided, markets emptied early, trust rationed carefully. These were the kinds of social fractures analysts had seen before in other parts of the world, just months before violence crossed a threshold from episodic to systemic. Quietly, Nigeria began appearing in internal comparisons no one wanted to make publicly. This was the moment the issue stopped being abstract for Washington. Religious violence, once framed as tragic but distant, was now being read as a destabilizing multiplier, one that could weaken Nigeria's ability to police its borders, fight extremism, and hold its federation together. If the balance tipped, it wouldn't just be Nigeria responding. Neighbors would feel it. Trade routes would strain. Migration flows would surge, and global powers would be forced to react, whether they wanted to or not. By the time pressure from Washington became visible, it was already the result of months of internal debate. The Trump administration did not arrive at Nigeria's doorstep out of moral outrage alone. It arrived with spreadsheets, risk models, and geopolitical memories. Officials remembered how quickly local instability in other regions had spiraled into international emergencies: Syria, Libya, parts of the Sahel. In those cases, early warnings were acknowledged but not acted upon decisively. Nigeria, many feared, was standing at a similar edge, only on a much larger scale. Behind closed doors, diplomats spoke carefully but urgently. Nigeria was not just another country experiencing unrest. It was Africa's most populous nation, a critical security partner, and a symbolic anchor of democratic possibility on the continent. If religious violence weakened the state's legitimacy, extremist groups would gain oxygen. If the federal government lost credibility with its citizens, foreign investment would hesitate. Already, investors across Europe were recalculating exposure. Markets dislike uncertainty, and Nigeria was beginning to signal too much of it at once. This is where Trump's approach surprised even seasoned observers. Known for transactional pressure rather than subtle diplomacy, he treated the issue less as a moral plea and more as a strategic warning. The message, conveyed bluntly, was simple: instability would have consequences. Not just for Nigeria, but for its relationship with the world's most powerful actors. For some, it felt intrusive. For others, overdue. But everyone understood one thing clearly: Washington believed time was running out. The ripple effects began almost immediately. African governments watched cautiously, weighing solidarity against pragmatism. Economic partners in Europe and Asia sent quiet signals. Instability in Nigeria could affect trade, energy, and regional security. Analysts tracked supply chains, cross-border migration, and even the fragile ecosystems of local economies, realizing that a crisis here would not remain confined. Investors, reading the same signs, hesitated. Stock indices wavered, commodities reacted, and the world began to notice that a local conflict could have global echoes. Meanwhile, inside Nigeria, the pressure was palpable. Leaders faced unprecedented scrutiny, not just from citizens, but from a global audience measuring every policy, every response. Social media amplified perceptions, both accurate and distorted. Fear became a currency, shaping decisions in ways that textbooks could not predict. Foreign NGOs and international organizations scrambled to understand the implications, while diplomats exchanged notes that hinted at urgency without alarming the public. The tension was no longer hypothetical; it had taken shape in boardrooms, offices, and households alike. Trump's pressure, calculated and relentless, revealed a paradox. The United States sought stability but could only influence outcomes indirectly. Warnings were issued, meetings scheduled, and channels of communication activated, yet the trajectory of the crisis remained uncertain. Could Nigeria reconcile internal divisions fast enough? Could regional neighbors absorb shocks without collapse? Every question hung in the air, unanswered, as the world collectively held its breath, waiting to see if a single nation's instability might ignite a cascade felt far beyond its borders. By the time the world fully grasped the stakes, much had already been set in motion. Nigeria's struggles were no longer just domestic headlines. They had become a prism through which the global community measured risk, resilience, and responsibility. Citizens felt the quiet weight of international attention. Their daily routines, their safety, and their futures were suddenly entangled with decisions made thousands of miles away. Analysts in London, New York, and Abuja spoke of patterns and probabilities, yet the human faces behind the data, families navigating fear, communities clinging to fragile trust, were often overlooked. The paradox was striking. A country rich in culture, energy, and potential was simultaneously admired and feared, its very significance making its vulnerabilities a global concern. Economists and political strategists debated the ripple effects of unrest on trade, investment, and diplomacy, while citizens lived the reality of delayed responses, cautious movements, and uncertain futures. In quiet moments, it became clear: the world's gaze, as well-intentioned as it might be, could never replace the lived experience of those on the ground. And yet, there was hope in understanding. By recognizing the warning signs early, the international community gained insight into the delicate balance between local dynamics and global consequences. Nigeria's story became a reminder that instability anywhere can have resonance everywhere, and that ignoring signals comes at a human and economic cost that no model could fully capture. The lessons extended beyond borders. Observers around the world began to see patterns in how power, faith, and population intersect, and how quickly local tensions could become global questions. For policymakers, it was a test of foresight. For citizens, it was a reminder of how interconnected modern life had become. Every decision, every escalation, every silence carried weight far beyond immediate perception. Nigeria's experience was no longer just a story of one nation. It was a lens through which the world could examine its own vulnerabilities. Families in affected regions learned to navigate uncertainty with resilience, improvising solutions and finding courage in daily routines. Religious leaders, community organizers, and young activists became unwitting diplomats of stability, bridging divides that governments struggled to manage. And though the pressure from Washington remained distant in geography, its impact was immediate in consequence, forcing reflection on the delicate interplay between domestic realities and global responsibility. Ultimately, the story lingers not because of the headlines, but because of what it reveals about human systems, how fragile yet adaptive they are, and how early warnings, if heeded, can save not just economies or governments but lives. In the quiet, we are reminded that the cost of inaction is often invisible until it is too late, and that understanding the signals of the world requires both attention and empathy. In the end, these stories reveal that borders may divide us, but crises remind us how closely our fates are intertwined. Nigeria's journey is not just its own, it is a mirror of how local decisions ripple across the globe, touching economies, cultures, and human lives in ways we often fail to see. Understanding these signals and the people behind them is more than information, it is insight into our shared responsibility as a global community. Every conflict, every warning, every choice echoes far beyond its origin, and in paying attention, we gain the chance to act before it is too late.